Thank you, Mr. Kurski. Now, I'm not sure whether Mr. Ferreira would like to speak. Is it the case? Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, President. The situation in Bahrain is one of ferocious repression against the people who are fighting for democracy and freedom, and we want to express our full solidarity with them. We've heard numerous examples of the repression in the course of the debate. Now, this debate, or rather this repression, counts on the support of other countries, the Emirates and Saudi Arabia. And let's not forget that Saudi Arabia harbors the Fifth Fleet of the United States. Now it's time to put an end to this instrumentalization of human rights, which puts them at second stage to imperialist concerns. We've got to put an end to this kind of counter hypocrisy. Human rights are okay for interference to take hold of resources, and then of course we just keep quiet when friendly regimes engage in repression. There is complicity with these regimes, and we must denounce it. Thank you.
Obrigado. And the last speaker in this round will be Senor Silvestris. Prego.
Nel Bahrain la famiglia regnante ha
The king's family rejected reform, and there has been increased repression, but the Arab world is changing. Saudi Arabia has been immune to the winds of democracy which are blowing through the region and to social political development. A court in Bahrain sentenced 14 people, including women, last year, and they were put in prison because they protested. And people were sentenced for causing chaos and unrest among the population during a protest in a shopping centre, and they were put in prison for having had a little protest of about 5 people. There have been protests going on since earlier this year, and hundreds of people have been arrested. Various sides have proposed a peaceful solution to the crisis. The document calls for democratic reform and an elected government, but those requests have been rejected. The European Union cannot remain silent about this clear violation of human rights and freedom of opinion. Thank you.
Grazie. Madame Kroes, what does the Commission think about the situation in Bahrain?
Thank you, Mr. President. Honourable members of Parliament, at the outset I should like to acknowledge the important role this Parliament has played in making sure that the situation in Bahrain remains high on the EU's public agenda. As Lady Ashton said in this chamber 2 weeks ago, we welcome some recent positive steps, namely the decision to annul the charges and sentences against the medical staff and order in retrial in civilian courts. However, it is vital, Mr. President, that justice is administered fairly and transparently. We remain convinced that a proper investigation in which the right of defence is exercised correctly should lead to these charges being dropped. We also recall that the medics are just one of the many groups of civilians who have been subject to harassment, unjustified arrest and harsh sentences, including the death sentences. Retrials should be extended to all civilians tried in a national safety court. We are looking forward, Mr. President, to the results of the Independent Commission of Inquiry, the announcement of which was publicly welcomed by the EU. We hope that after it reports in November, action will be taken to follow up on its findings. We are also looking forward to the promised visit by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The Commission of Inquiry should offer a platform for reconciliation. The rifts in Bahraini society can only be addressed through a deep and inclusive national dialogue where all parties can be heard. Clearly, all human rights violations must stop. Our fear, Mr. President, is that the more time passes without positive action, the more difficult it will be to establish meaningful national dialogue. And the EU has repeated this essential message one of encouragement, not mere condemnation, in many public statements and direct contacts between the High Representative Vice President and the most senior Bahraini representatives. Our exchanges with the authorities and with all the parties involved will continue. We all share an interest in Bahrain's reforms, unity and prosperity. We will also continue to listen to the concerns of peaceful Bahraini civil society. We will continue to strongly encourage and support them to continue with the national dialogue and to agree on reforms to the benefit of all Bahraini citizens.
Commissioner, the debate on the situation in Bahrain is closed. We will take the votes right after we finish our last item on the agenda, and that's the case of Rafa Najid in Syria. We will start with Mr. Bielan. Proszę.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Different regimes shake and crumble, but Mr. Assad's regime resorts to violence and persecution of their own people. Human rights are being trampled. Rafa Najid is the world-famous, the first female psychoanalyst in Syria, and her arbitrary arrest shows how desperate the regime is. The freedom movement in Syria is growing stronger and stronger, and the dictator sees that his end is nigh. The arbitrary arrest of Rafa Najid goes against the grain of all norms in our civilization. She has been accused of trumped-up charges. She has been offering workshops for victims and people who live in fear, and the charges against her are a sign of paranoia from the dictator. Persecution in Syria has to stop, and Rafa Najid has to be liberated, as well as other journalists and freedom fighters. She fights for proper dialogue in Syria. I hope her legacy is going to be protected.
Dziękuję bardzo. Dalším řečníkem je pan poslanec Maštálka.
Pane předsedo, kolegyně a kolegové,
Ladies and gentlemen, obviously I'm in favour of the liberation of Rafa Najid. I assume that she's innocent.